Okay, we are at Mem Days 40b. We're about less than a quarter of the way down at the two dots. Rabbi Yehudah, okay, so basically you sell your friend filtered oil. You can give, for every 100 units of oil, you could pull out 1.5%. You don't have to give him 1.5%. Why? Because for the 1.5%, you're entitled to give him the dregs. So if you're giving him purified oil, so you don't have to give him the dregs at all, and you can deduct 1.5% from that total. Okay, so Amar Abayas says, "Kshetim tzalayim l'divrei Yehudah muter la'arav shmarm, l'divrei Chachamim also la'arav shmarm." According to Rabbi Yehudah, you deduct 1.5%. That means that according to Rabbi Yehudah, it should be permissible to mix in the dregs with the 100. According to the rabbis, it should be prohibited to mix them together. Okay, and the idea is sort of like this. According to Rabbi Yehudah, you're able to give him 98.5 units of oil and 1.5 units of dregs separately. And according to the rabbis, you can't give it to him separately. There's no such deduction. So if you have the dregs inside, then you give him 100 units with 1.5% dregs. Mm-hmm. But if you don't have dregs at all, you have to give him a full 100 units. So presumably, according to Rabbi Yehudah, you would have the fact that Rabbi Yehudah allows you an entitlement of 1.5% for the dregs means that you'd be allowed to mix it in directly. So Rabbi Yehudah basically says, well, why should you mix it in? You can give the guy separately. You can give him 98.5 units of oil, and then you give him a big pitcher with 1.5 units of dregs. And according to the rabbis, it's prohibited, so therefore you have from 100 units of oil. We'll soon see the Gemara is not very convinced that, so in other words, what is the actual argument? According to Rabbi Yehudah, you can give 98.5. According to the rabbis, you have to give the full 100. Maybe there's dregs in it, maybe there's no dregs in it, but you have to give 100. And the maximum allowance of dregs is 1.5 units of that 100. The Gemara, Abaye is interpreting this debate now as dependent on the debate of whether I'm allowed to take those 1.5% dregs and pour it back in. We'll soon see that the Gemara proposes the opposite in a moment. But for now, the Gemara proposes, according to Rabbi Yehudah, it is permitted. According to the rabbis, it is not permitted. Okay. Behind the time of the Makabel, the seller could tell the buyer, if I wanted to add it in, I could have added in. Hashtanami kabel. So now basically accept 98.5 plus 1.5 dregs separately. Or alternatively, I won't even give you the dregs. Because like, what exactly are you going to do with it? But if you sold it to me, it's one thing to put it in the sale. But if you give it to me as a separate unit, what exactly am I supposed to do with it? So the Gemara says, so the Gemara says, well, look, he could tell him, he says, look, I could have mixed it in, but you prefer a filtered oil without the dregs. So I'm actually doing you a favor by giving it to you separately. I'm giving you a more premium product. Well, maybe the buyer could say, look, if the dregs weren't there, so then too bad. You lost your allowance for the dregs. You've forgiven it. It's true you could have given me a net weight of 98.5 units of oil and 1.5 units of dregs inside the oil. But because you didn't actually do that, you've forgiven it. So you've forgiven your allowance. It's like you've had an opportunity to take off a larger tear, and you didn't. So too bad. That's sort of what the buyer is telling the seller. I don't want the dregs in a separate unit or a deduction at all. I want you to sort of forgive the fact that you could have given me garbage and now give me the full thing. Give me the full 100 units, as it's supposed to be. So Gemara says, Rabbi Yehudah presumes that in a sale, you don't presume anybody's forgiving anything. Meaning, if I buy something from you, then we specify what exactly I bought. And nothing else is included. The Talmud we learned in the Mishnah. Tzemed is a yoke. It's the piece that goes on top of either one or two cows, or maybe more, and that sort of connects them with the plow in the back. So if you sell a guy an animal, the tzemed, the yoke, is not included. Similarly, if you sell a yoke, you didn't include the animal. Rabbi Yehudah says, the money is the proof. Kate said, so Rabbi Yehudah says, look at the value. If the guy does 200 coins for the tzemed, so clearly there he included the animal as well, because nobody sells a yoke just for 200 zuz. And the rabbis say no, it could be that just the yoke was sold for 200 zuz. Okay, the point is, according to Rabbi Yehudah, the money proves what the value of the item is, and nothing else was included. There's no add-ons. So therefore, presumably, according to Rabbi Yehudah, even if the guy is entitled to give a dreg allowance, right, then he doesn't forgive that allowance. He still wants, if not the allowance, the deduction that the allowance provided. Meaning, every time you sell 100 units, you're entitled to give within the mixture, right, 1.5% dregs. So that's sort of the allowance. Now, Rabbi Yehudah says, okay, well, you don't forgive the allowance, meaning, so if your oil is pure, you can give 98.5. You don't have to give, you don't have to give the full 100, because you don't forgive the allowance. And the rabbis would say otherwise. Okay, the rabbis say, okay, the different according to the rabbis, remember, according to the rabbis, you have to give the full 100, whether the oil is pure oil, it's free from dregs, or it has dregs in it. Doesn't make a difference. It's the full 100. So also Arav Shmarim, you can't mix in the dregs. Behind the time until Mikabel, the Amarlei Bayis Leiruve Miha V'Sharilach. Hashanami Lekabilna Loy Mikabilna. According to the rabbis, it is not permissible to mix it back together, and therefore the owner can say, "Look, I want the full 100, and you've forgiven the allowance." For Papa says Tabaya Adraba, to the contrary, the opposite makes sense. Again, the critical argument between the rabbis and Rabbi Yehudah is, can I give 98.5 if I'm giving pure oil? Rabbi Yehudah says yes, the rabbis say no. The Gemara first interprets this, that Rabbi Yehudah says that he's entitled to mix the dregs back in. So he's also entitled to give him 98.5, or to give 98.5 plus a container full of dregs. However, the rabbi's opinion is you have to give a full 100. So now Rapapa proposes as follows. According to the rabbis, you're permitted to mix the dregs back in. So now the Gemara proposes that you actually could put the dregs back in. But if you didn't put the dregs back in, then he's forgiven the dreg allowance. Rabbi Yehudah also Rabbi Yehudah says you can't put it back in. Behind the time of the Mikabel, okay, according to Rabbi Yehudah, the guy says, look, I don't forgive the allowance of 1.5, which means that if I don't sell you as 98.5 as 100, then I'm not. The Gemara says, Zovin v'Zovin Tigrekri. If a guy is a businessman, this is how he does business. He buys something for 100 and he sells it for 100, right? It's not going to work. You have to make money. So the guy says, look, I'm saving you the allowance. I need to make money on the deal also. So that's why I'm entitled to give you 98.5. Okay. That's an alternative way of looking at the Mishnah. As far as how do they translate pekotim? Sediment. No. Scum. Okay. It's interesting because I've seen a few interpretations. Rashi says the scum is sort of it's particles from the seeds. So it's something sort of suspended within the item, something similar to dregs. Maybe dregs sink to the bottom, the scum sort of floats around. So what's the story with that? Mylap kotim. Okay, 1 second, hold on. Okay, so the Gemara says the rule of the buyer and the guy watching, the oil is that they both have to deal with the scum. The Gemara says, what exactly does that mean? Okay, what does it mean? So the Gemara proposes, just like the buyer does not accept the scum, he wants it filtered out. So too, a watchman doesn't accept it either. One second. If the watchman gives if the owner gives the watchman scum, then he gets it back, obviously. Why should it be the watchman's responsibility to deal with it? So clearly the watchman, he sort of does accepts it with the scum, and the guy gets it back with the scum in it. Now remember, the critical rule here, by the way, is that this type of watching arrangement was not that it was watched in the barrels. It was transferred to the watchman's silos or any sort of storage method he had. Right? That's why this is an issue in the first place. If the guy gave it to him in barrels, then of course he gives the guy the same barrels he gave him. It's no issue. Right? The scenario here, and the same was true of grain and the other points in the previous Gemara. The watchman receives it into his own storage vessels. So he gets it with scum, so he gives it back with scum. So the Gemara says, you're right, just like the watchman receives it with the scum in it, and he has to deal with it that way. So the buyer also, he is forced to accept it with the scum. So the Gemara says, does the buyer accept to have these sediment flying around? Okay, so you have cloudy oil, right? This is not uncommon, depending if the oil was filtered or you have to also otherwise remove the different, however the oil was made, different what's called
Particles.
different particles, the things that the different contaminants in the oil. Okay, so the buyer accepts 1.5 units, 1.5% dregs, and not sediment. So the review is pretty clear, right? The buyer does not accept sediment or scum. He doesn't accept the scum. Sorry, he doesn't accept the scum. So with the previous Bryce, it says he does accept the scum, and now Rabbi Yehudah is saying he doesn't accept it. So which is it? So the Gemara says basically it depends on, before you see the Gemara, it depends on which time of year. If you bought the oil in Tishrei, since fall, so that's when everybody's pressing the oil is very dirty. It's full of contaminants. However, if you bought the oil in Nisan, you presume that the scum had already been removed and separated, and therefore then you do not accept the scum. Let's just see. So the Gemara says like kasha. One scenario was where he gave him money in Tishrei in full time because Shakam Nisan came to the Tishrei, and he collects it in Nisan, but the same measurements given in Tishrei, meaning the oil is still, it has the scum, it still has the scum in it. It has more contaminants. However, in the other scenarios where you pay the money in Nisan, the spring, when the oil has already had time to clarify and for the contaminants to be removed, so then you expect a sort of a pure product without the scum attached to it. Okay. Mishnah. Okay, so let's try to make an interesting point here before we set out. So let's say I borrowed, I was watching for you a barrel of your oil, right? So you might think the most ideal place for that is in, let's say, in my wine cellar. Of course, you know I live in a very big fancy mansion and I have a wine cellar in my basement. So I put it in the wine cellar. Okay, so now the idea here is that the wine cellar is sort of a dedicated spot for it, right? On the other hand, if I put it into my garage, and if any of you see my garage, you know exactly why I'm giving that example. It doesn't really have a spot. you can expect that's sort of going to move around the garage as the bikes come in and out, and we need to sort of figure out where to put things. Okay. So this time it went to the garage. It didn't really have a place. It was sort of going to be moved around. Okay. And I was moving it around. And it broke as I was moving it. If it broke while I was moving it. So if it was moved, chayav, potter. Okay. If it was moved for the purposes of the barrel, so meaning the kids were riding around the bikes, and they were going to crash into the barrel and tip the whole thing over. So I figured, let me get the barrel out of the way. It should be safe, right? Keyword safety, right? So that means that I'm doing it because I want to do my obligation. I want to fulfill it by making sure the barrel stays whole. Okay, in that case, so then potter, I'm exempt. But if it's l'tzar kai, it's my purposes. It's inconvenient for me at the moment. It's in front of the freezer and I need to get something from the freezer. So I'm moving it for my own purposes. So then I would be liable if it broke, if I carried it and it broke as I carried it. Okay, very important point here. Okay, so it was in front of the freezer. I moved it away from the freezer, put it down, and then a day later it suddenly broke. Or the other way, where my kids were going to crash into it, so I moved it to the side, and it broke the next day. So in either of these cases, once I put it back down, then I lose the liability. Meaning that now that I've put it down, even though I shouldn't have been moving it when it was in front of my freezer, but it does make a difference. Now I put it down, I've sort of returned it as is. Wherever, because it doesn't have a dedicated place. Okay. 1 second. So let's say I put it in my wine cellar. So it has a specific place. It's in a certain corner. The tilt line, I was moving it. Okay. If, on the other hand, it had a dedicated space and I moved it for my own purposes, and it broke either while I was carrying it or even after I put it back in the same place, I am liable. However, if it was being moved for the purposes of the barrel, then I'm exempt. In other words, if there was some sort of sudden potential danger for the barrel, could have broke or something, and then I moved it, then I would not be liable. Okay. So now the Gemara sort of proposes that this is analogous to another question, which is, let's say I steal something and I put it back from where I stole it. So I took an animal from a herd, and the owner doesn't know, and I return it to the herd in a way that the owner doesn't either know. So the guy doesn't even know that somebody stole something and returned it. Do I fulfill my obligation or not? So the sort of analogy is that a specific place that's like the owner's spot, the owner's wallet, so to speak. So if it has a specific place, or if there's no place at all, then any place is the owner's place. And as soon as I put it back down, I'm exempt. I've returned the item, so to speak. So let's see. You don't need the owner's knowledge when returning a stolen item. The Tanya we learned, somebody steals a sheep from a herd, the selam in a kiss or $1 from a wallet. The Makam Shagon of Yachser, Diver Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Shmuel says you return it to exactly from where you took it. You don't have to notify the owner. Rabbi Kiva says, no, tzarech to asbailam, you need to tell him. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shmuel, if we're going with the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel, my area, lo yichtu, I feel yichtu nami. Okay, so according to Rabbi Shmuel, you don't need to return it to the original place, which means that if the barrel did not have a dedicated space, wherever you put it down, that's called returning it. Okay. So Gemara says, if that's the case, nami. Well, the same rule would also apply if I returned it to the owner's space. Meaning, according to Rabbi Shmuel, it's true in both scenarios. If I took the item and if the item did or didn't have a dedicated space. If it didn't have a dedicated space, I took it and I put it back anywhere. Or it did have a dedicated space, I took it and put it back in the dedicated space. In all of these instances, there's sort of like a mini robbery here, right? Oh. It's what do they call this? A statutory robbery, right? Because statutorily, you weren't supposed to be doing this. You weren't supposed to be moving it away from your freezer door. and then you put it back, meaning you returned it. So you exempt yourself from responsibility. We're together? Okay, so the Gemara says, the same rule applies even if it did have a dedicated space. The Gemara says, you're right. If it didn't have dedicated space, any space is the space. So also it's considered, you statutorily return the statutory stolen item. Okay. So Gemara says, Ema Seifa, look at the end of the brisa. The owner did dedicate a space and he moved it for his own reasons and it broke. Who's this going? Rabbi Kiva. This is going according to Rabbi Kiva's opinion. Rabbi Kiva says when you return an item, you must notify the owner. So therefore, you stole the item because you moved it away from where it was supposed to be for your own reasons, and then you put it back there. It doesn't count. You still have to let the owner know. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Kiva, if it's your opinion of Rabbi Kiva, so according to Rabbi Kiva, even if he didn't dedicate a space, you'd also have to let the owner know. You stole the item by moving it without permission, so you should tell the owner that you moved it, and that's considered returning the item to him. So Gemara says, you're right. In other words, even in a scenario where you did have a dedicated space and you returned it to the dedicated space, it's not considered to have, you're not considered to have the equivalent of notifying the owner. You still need to tell him if you want to exempt yourself from liability. So Gemara says, Reisha Rabbi Shmuel, say for Rabbi Kiva. Turns out the first half of the mission is Rabbi Shmuel, the second half of the mission is Rabbi Kiva. So Gemara says, yeah, you're right, correct. Whoever can explain to me that our mission is a single authorship, I'll carry his stuff to the bathhouse for him. I'll be a servant, basically. Because Rabbi Yechon basically was saying there's no way to screw this mission according to one opinion. Okay, but now we'll have an attempt. Rabbi Yaakov Barabba explains it could be the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel, and he took it with the intention of stealing it. Okay, or Tirgum of Nasa Barabba Kamedir Rav Shenotla Amanas L'Shleach Bayad. Where the other possibilities where he took it, in other words, he took it with the intention of damaging it, and then he put it back. Give me a second here. Okay, so basically the idea is as follows. The idea is what's called returning it to the owner. So if there's no dedicated place, then any place you put the barrel is considered the owner's place because it doesn't have a dedicated place. If he does have a dedicated place, you have to put it back in that dedicated place. However, if you took it with the intention of stealing it or with the intention of damaging it, so then returning it to the owner's space is not enough. You have to notify him. Okay, I'll explain in a moment. But what exactly is the debate here? So the Gemara, in other words, why does Rabbi Yaakov disagree with Rabbi Nosson? So the Gemara says, "B'shlichus yatzir chasar and man amar legoizla kasav shlichus yatzir chasar and man amar shlach b'yad kasav shlichus yad ein yatzir chasar." Okay, basic idea is that if a watchman takes something with the intention of doing damage to it, so the guy is about to, break his friend's glass cup or glass barrel, for example, and he has a change of heart and decides he's not going to be so evil and he's not going to do it. So is he considered to have touched the item with the intention of doing damage? According to Rabbi Yaakov, no, because you actually have to do damage. And according to Rabbi Nosson, yeah, because all you need is the intention to do damage. So you're already a thief as soon as you took it with the intention of shattering it with a baseball bat. So Masik for Rav Sheshas, Rav Shesha says, "Midi not l'katani." Does it say that it was taken? Tilt l'katani. The implication here was it was sort of moved it wasn't taken, it was moved. So Gemara says, "Alam Rav Shesha sach ma'askin you should tilt l'havi la geizlus." The savar shalosh lamidas gazan. Okay, so Rav Shesha offers an alternative. He says, "What does it mean?" He says he took it. He wanted to go get birds from the nest, So he needed something to stand on. So he used the barrel as if it was a ladder. And in other words, he borrowed his friend's item without permission. And we're going with the opinion that says borrowing without permission has the statutory status of stealing. So he's a robber. Okay, let's explain now. The Kula Rabbi Shmuel, the entire mission is Rabbi Shmuel. The Seifa Shanicha Makam She'ena Mekayma. And the end of the Mishnah is even though it had a dedicated space, you returned it to a different spot, not to the dedicated space. Okay. And because of that, you didn't put it back from where you took it. So therefore you're liable. Unless you moved it because of the item's need. As the item was in a dangerous spot, so you had to move it away. So then you put it in a different spot, that's permissible. But if you stole the item effectively, either because you intended on damaging it, or because you actually wanted to steal it, or because you borrowed it, so to speak, this is statutory thievery, and you put it back into the wrong place, so it's the wrong place, you haven't returned it yet. You're still liable on the item. Now, this is a little bit different than the Mishnah, because until now we were implying in the Mishnah that you stole it from a dedicated space and you returned it to that dedicated space. And now we're saying no. You took it from a dedicated space, you returned it to a different space. And that's why Rabbi Yochanan rejects these alternatives. For Rabbi Yochanan implies that no. The implication of the mission is you returned it exactly to the place that you stole it from.
The space where all this is stored is where the shomer is.
The shomer's house.
Okay, the shomer's house. So
Either in a place that was dedicated inside the house or a place that wasn't dedicated.
So when he moves from one position to another position, it's.
So
it doesn't affect the.
So the Gemara is really saying it depends on why he moved it. If he moved it for the purposes of the barrel, to better watch the barrel, then that's permissible. If not, it's not permissible.
Who put the barrel down in the first place? The owner
Either
brought it in?
either one. Either one. Yeah.
Doesn't matter.
Okay. We'll stop here. Next Gemara is a little bit of one. Okay. Pleasure. Have a great day. Sorry, I forgot that was Rosh Hashanah.
You won't forget it.